We'll call to order. And first one, two, General Laws, Chapter 30A, Section 20B. Following a declaration of state of emergency in the Commonwealth arising from the COVID-19 pandemic, the committee will meet virtually utilizing Zoom technology. All votes will be taken by roll call vote, and the meeting will be recorded. We'll open with a roll call. Gina Stino's absent this evening. Mike Barclay.
Present.
Fran Collins is not here. Patrick Kennedy. I see him.
I'm
There
here.
he is. You
It
are.
only took me 15 minutes to try and get on, but I'm here.
Wow. Mark Maggi,
Here.
Ellen Marr,
Present.
Mary McGoldrick,
Here.
and Meg Wheeler indicated that she would not be with us this evening. So the first thing kind of on our agenda, both literally and figuratively, is this is the meeting, this is the time of the year when the advisory committee provides the select board with a budget statement, which the select board uses in connection with issuing their budget statement, which they generally issue sometime toward the end of September. So I had circulated the budget statement that was issued by our committee last year. And in order to not be prescriptive, but in order to move the conversation a little bit, I sent out a markup, but like I said, it's only a markup for the purposes of a discussion. The ultimate document is the product of agreement of all of us, or at least a majority of us. Just by way of background, this document tends to have a lot of continuity from year to year. It's a little like jazz. I mean, everybody gets the music and then you play some variations. And it's like that for good reason, because a lot of the budget goals are stable. A couple of the things that I think are worth us discussing are there's been language in it for the last couple of years concerning the reserve fund and the failure of the town to include in the budget a balance for the reserve fund that meets the town's stated goal for the reserve fund. In short, for those of you who we haven't accessed the reserve fund in a while, there is within the bylaws and pursuant to state law, cities and towns anyhow, can maintain a reserve fund for unexpected expenses up to 5% of its budget, which would be a little excessive. It's funded as a budget item. It's the gatekeeper to that is the advisory committee. It's our only actual piece of our only bit of actual authority. And if there is a project or a problem that responds to the triggers in the bylaw and the related statute, we can vote to apply that. Now, there has been an ongoing discussion since a budget reserve fund policy was passed in 2015 or 16 that called for the balance in that line to escalate to 1% of the budget by 2018 or 19, which would last year have been about $440,000. It was not funded at that level. It was funded at $243,500. And it's expected to escalate in that ballpark, which is something in the vicinity of generously 60% of target. Pardon me if you all know this, and I'm just reiterating things, but we had a fairly lengthy discussion about this with Don last year. And he certainly did not favor funding it all the way up. Mostly because it creates a drag on the rest of the budget. So here's what happens. The money goes in, whether it's 250 or 450. It sits in the reserve fund against unanticipated issues. There are a couple of examples of the advisory committee over the last 6 years using it. There are more on that spreadsheet. I just sent you examples of it from years prior, but I wasn't able to get what those expenditures were for in time. But it is there. It's a reserve fund. At the end of the year, by statute, the reserve fund is drawn down to zero, and that money can be applied elsewhere. I think it's to free cash. But as a practical matter, when Don discussed this with us last year, it's used to fund up some places where the budget is otherwise short. My recollection is that it helps with items like police overtime. So, and it goes back down to zero, and it gets funded up with the next budget to wherever the proposed budget and town meeting choose to put it. We probably should have addressed this when we were doing the budget in the spring. That's my fault. We had made a pronouncement that it should be 1%. And then when it came around to budget time, did I call that issue forward? No, I did not. So sorry. But I think perhaps it's time to call that question, if only for this reason. And this is just what I think, and I'm sure there are reasonable alternative ways of thinking. It seems to me if you have a policy that calls for 1%, it either fund it to 1% or make a decision not to and change the policy. But not abiding by a policy year in, year out is just a bad practice and perhaps a bad precedent. So I think our statement ought to be that by Springtown meeting, perhaps we should revisit the reserve fund policy and either make it an affirmative decision that it should be 6/6 of a percent rather than a full percent, or make noise about it being funded all the way up. One last just sort of data point for consideration too, is that the two expenditures that I can recall, maybe three, in the years I've been on, the 4 years or so I've been on the advisory committee. One had to do with a doorway at the middle high school, which had basically failed and it needed to be replaced. I don't know, it was just locking mechanisms or a whole thing. It was a door and it was $30,000 and we approved it and it got fixed. The other was, perhaps ironically, town hall prior to Cohasset 250 was looking poorly. And there's a request to do kind of an interim paint job and lead abatement on it. And it turned out that, to spiff it up so it didn't look too bad for the Cohasset 250. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter how it all played out. I think the job ended up being a lot cheaper than expected. The lead abatement was less or something like that. But the important thing is that the advisory committee, possibly stretching a point, decided that that was a qualifying expense and agreed to fund it from the reserve fund. Prior to that, I do recall that there was a truck motor blowout, which seems to me to be exactly what the reserve fund was designed for. And then there's some other fairly large disbursements from back in the early teens that I simply don't recall what they were. For the purposes of our budget statement, we can say X, and then if we want to pursue this in the budget, we can refine it a little bit. But that's what is up with that. And one last thing, and then I'll stop droning on and on. But I think that probably, all of us at one point or another have had to draft a document in a group. And I think we all can perhaps agree that that's not the most efficient way to draft the document. So I thought we'd get comments, and if everybody's comfortable with it, take a vote at the end to direct Mary and I to compile the comments into a document and send it to the select board. But we'll deal with that when we get to a motion. So why don't we start at the beginning, looking at I don't know if you want to work off of my comments draft or whether you want to work off last year's message without my editorial additions. Does anybody have an opinion about that?
So I have to just say, I'm having trouble pulling it up in the email for whatever reason. It won't let me pull up the PDF that you sent. So I'm still working on that.
Well,
So
the PDF that I sent was the budget book, and it's very, very large. So if it doesn't pull up as a PDF, you can grab it off the website. I'm referring to, I sent 2 Word documents. One is last year's budget message in Word, and one is last year's budget message in Word with some red lines on it that are really just my openers.
Okay. I see them.
So, I mean, unless somebody feels strongly otherwise, why don't we start with the document called FY24 advisory, and it's got some of my markups in it, but like I said, I'm not wedded to any of them.
Can I just ask a question about the reserve policy in general?
Yeah.
And maybe I'm not getting all the buckets of where we have cash, put away. We've had a couple conversations about rating agencies and how they look at towns, and the level of reserves is typically one of the only financial metrics that that they can really point to when they're looking at a municipality. And to your point, Rob, I think, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but we have a policy, and if we're not following it, then that's another thing that we have to consider. But just hearing that we allocate, and then at the end of the year we take it down to zero. I guess the question is, as its purpose is a rainy day fund, where is that going? And if our snow budget is under, or like you said, a truck bus, breaks down or something, how do we then fund that if it's a really big, or if special ed is more than the school expects it to be, things like that. So this is a dumb question that I should have known already. I'm just, because typically reserve funds are set aside, and there's a certain level of reserves that are there, and that's a metric that can be measured.
Reserve funds have their own kind of separate statutory authority, and they act in a very particular way. So let's see if I have this right. That's cities reserve funds. It's a reserve fund provides for, like I said, the language they use is extraordinary or unforeseen expenditures, and it's by design a 1-year fund. So it's not the same as a rainy day fund or other funds that exist. The money goes in through the budget. It only comes out depending on which board within town government is assigned with the authority, which is to say us. And then and in so doing, our authority is only to transfer from the reserve fund to another account, not directly to an expense. The reserve funds, and they can't be earmarked for a particular purpose. And I believe that by statute, at the end of the year in which they're appropriated, reserve funds are returned to an account like free cash. So it's not really a reserve the way other things are a reserve. It's a specific sort of thing. Mary, you may have a much better understanding of that than I do.
So is that the difference between the undesignated fund balance then, that? Because I'm going through the note from last year, so of approximately 1.4 to 1.9 million. So anyway, sorry, just, I get it. I get the point though on the first issue.
Yeah. Mary and then Mara.
Yes, so I agree with what you brought up, which is either we need to say we're going to fund it at 0.6% or fund it at a full 1% of the budget. My question is, if this has typically been used to cover police overtime and take that specific use out of the question, if it's continually being used for one item year after year, I would prefer that we right size that item in the budget rather than using this for that. And I'm looking
Well,
at.
let me actually, Mary, I may not have made myself clear. The reserve fund doesn't disperse reserve fund money for any particular
No,
purpose.
I understand that.
Anything that's left over goes into free cash.
Which then
as an
back out
as an
again.
accounting mechanism, it is typical, but money is fungible. So, but in terms of right sizing the places where it's going, yeah, I know what you mean, and I tend to agree. I don't tend to agree. I very much agree.
Right. I mean, and we've been fairly fortunate, last year there were hardly any uses, but we've had years in FY18 where we dispersed $164,000. That's a lot.
It is.
And if it's necessary, that's why you have that there. So it's just, I think we either change the policy or execute it according to the policy. Otherwise, why do you have the policy? That confuses me.
Yeah, there's something about, well, I don't need to editorialize. Mark, you had your hand up?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think we, as a town, as a board, we take a pretty conservative approach to this stuff. So it's easier maybe to justify missing the mark when you're missing a conservative mark. So I agree with both what you and Mary said in terms of just the policy or meet the policy. Just playing devil's advocate here. Let's say we did say it was 0.5% or whatever the number was going to be. And then we had an expense that exceeds that. What do we do? Like, is there another mechanism to fund the emergency? Are we being, again, I support our general conservative stance, and this isn't my preference. I'm just, an anticipated question would be, if a bigger expense, if all the doors in the high school broke, how do we pay for that?
It's a good question. I think, not to answer a question with a question, but I'm one of the problems you would have is, even if we were fully funded to 440 and we had a $500,000 problem, the town would be facing the same issue. But you're right. I mean, it's, what's the right number to guard against 90% of problems? But also, I'm not 100% sure. The towns tend to be able to find money someplace. And if they need to, they can call a special town meeting and do an appropriation if there's an incredible emergency, I suppose. But that's too dramatic. Chris, do you have anything in response to Mark's point? And then Ellen's got her hand up.
So again, forgive me if I do the foreign movie thing, if I get separated from my voice. So to the first point, I concur with what Don said last year. I appreciate why the policy was set as it was, but I think it needs to be revisited. And quite frankly, I think it should be lower. I don't think it's reasonable for us to get to 1%. I think it's too much money to be locked away when we're running budgets at the margin we are right now. We have plenty, we are at AAA levels in terms of our actual, as Mike pointed out, Mike Barkley was saying, our actual, in the bank reserve funds. The reserve fund is a line item that the advisory committee controls during the annual budget process, during the annual to cover something that otherwise wouldn't be coverable, which is what it's been done. It's not snow. Snow and ice has a whole separate mechanism. We never need it for snow and ice during the year. We did use it for COVID, if you recall, a year or two ago, because that was totally out of the blue. And the lead abatement was never, as you point out, that was actually funded in an alternative way. Initially came to this board first, but it ended up not being necessary. Most of the things, as you said, it's a breakdown, a window breaks, or multiple windows break, or doors, or some piece of equipment, and we don't have any other money, and it's too big. We do build in a little bit of cushion in the budgets for routine kind of stuff, like we do replace windows and doors. Instead of something more fundamental breaks, that's what this is for. So does that kind of answer the question, or add an element to
Mark?
this?
I guess my question is, like, if there is in case of emergency, break glass procedure, do we need a double redundancy to have a reserve fund and the in case of emergency break glass procedure? And if that secondary more emergency procedure exists, does the reserve fund need to be as big as it's been historically?
So my answer is that it probably doesn't. We do have, a lot of money in reserve, and there's mechanisms built into the law to protect you from these crazy things, right? If there's a natural disaster, there's ways around, you're protected from that. So this is kind of like an uninsured insurance policy. We have insurance policies too, right? Where, so this is other communities that are bigger than us make do with smaller numbers. I think, again, because of the margins, in a perfect world, if you have just unlimited amounts of money, yes, belts and suspenders, fiscally speaking, are good. At this point, I think where we are is, I think it's worth revisiting to a lower number, and it should be revisited, right? It should be checked every few years. Is it still a good policy? All of our policies should be looked at every few years, and we do look at them internally. And once Jennifer comes on in a couple of weeks, I expect her to look at them and make comments and come back to all of you this winter and say, hey, maybe we should do some updates. So we are covered, Mark. There are enough mechanisms to protect us, and we have insurance and this FEMA and MEMA and big real disasters. And this is more for the stuff that's more budgetary, that would, like I say, a blown motor, a door fails. That's really important.
Right. So it seems like, we have insurance, and I can't believe I'm taking the approach of maybe we can be a little less conservative, because that's generally not my stance on financial matters. But we have insurance, we have other sources of funds. If we need to kind of, raise kids' college fund, we can, but we're also keeping a giant bag of cash underneath, the dining room table. Like, do we need triple security redundancy? I don't know. Like, it's just maybe the target is too high.
So what this really does, if I might, I'm sorry, it's kind of like the instant response. So this is for something that we really,
right. It's like cash on hand, right?
Right, exactly. So this is something
One-stop shopping with the advisory committee, rather than trying to tap an insurer or make some sort of special appropriation. It's the emergency, and to be able to do it quick, which was the school's problem with this door. The door was broken. It needed to be fixed. There wasn't appropriated funds available. It checked all the boxes for the reserve fund. I'm sorry, Chris.
No, the other piece of it is that if you don't use it, it just becomes free cash, which is awesome, right? So it's a line item that is untouchable unless you really, really need it, and then it becomes kind of the beginning of your free cash for next year.
So Ellen, you had your hand up?
Yes, thank you. So let me take my hand down. So I'm looking at this like in a little different way. So with gold at 1%, our policy states 1%. And historically we run at about 0.6. Is that?
That's correct.
So my concern would be, having gone through budgeting processes, if we goal at 0.6, are we going to get 0.4? Or because we've never hit the goal. And what happens, is it a sliding scale that, okay, well, we don't really have to hit the goal of 1%, 0.6 is where we're at. So now the goal is 0.6. Are we going to get to 0.45, 0.5% and not hit the goal? I mean, I would rather look at hitting the goal, seeing if 1% of the levy, which is about what, $440,000?
A little
Isn't
bit more than that
utilized.
this year.
I'm just looking at the FY '23 recommended total tax levy limit from the budget book. Because that's where it only come from, is the tax levy, correct? Not cherry sheet, not
It comes, it's a percentage of the levy, that's correct.
of the levy, right? So 44 million in round numbers, right? So, and then track, if we're hitting 1%, what are we spending of the 1%? And then make an informed decision about lowering it if we're not achieving the one, if the town doesn't have the emergency level at 0.6. The only thing I would need to know about that strategy is what has been our cash back to free cash from the reserve fund for the last couple of years.
That's on the spreadsheet I just sent out a few minutes ago.
Okay,
And the answer is most of it for the last 3 years or so. There were bigger expenditures many years ago. Let me see if, and I apologize, I meant to send that.
oh,
thing out.
right, okay. So reserve fund balance prior to year-end transfers. So FY '18 was 60,197. It printed over multiple pages. FY '19. Okay. All right. I'm just concerned if you lower your goal, you're going to get a lower actual.
Well, I mean, if the budget process between the staff and us and the select board let that happen, they could do it anyhow. And if the budget were really squeezed one year, I could certainly see the temptation. But I'm not sure that, I think it's more of a number than a percentage, but that's just my impression. Patrick, then Mike?
Yeah, it seems to me that the usage is totally variable. It's totally random. So it's not targeted or a goal, or it's the unexpected, right? By definition, it should only be there for something that wasn't anticipated either as a capital item or as an ordinary budget item. So I don't know. It just seems like we are over targeted, or we are over funding this. So let's just cut it back to the average. It seems logical to me.
Mike?
Yeah, I mean, so just looking through the letter, the draft of the letter. So point two addresses this, and then point 3 talks about the undesignated fund balance. And so this is where I was getting confused, and I'm sorry to be dense, just kind of lack of sleep this week. So what's the purpose of the undesignated fund balance then? Is that's the rainy day fund, right? And what we're talking about in point 2 is just allocating a certain amount for that particular fiscal year in case something goes wrong that year. And as long as the undesignated fund is where it should be, then if it doesn't get used in a certain year, it can just get kicked back to free cash and go wherever it may go.
That's my understanding, is if undesignated funds are free cash. And I have the benefit of having, older documents in front of me, but an earlier version of this document, nearly identical, stated that, urged the select board to go up to the full percent, and then noted that given that the town had a separate policy for free cash to be between 3 to 4% of the annual operating budget, excluding enterprise funds, that going up to 1% just helped because that would automatically become free cash. But those of us who were with Don in the room last year, I'm sort of carrying water for him a little bit, but if he were here, he would say that you're taking $100-something thousand, maybe close to $200,000 out of the budget. And that could be allocated and appropriated for other purposes and locking it up into free cash, which means that $200,000 worth of town services won't get rendered because, as Chris points out, our budgets are, right at the margin. And while the free cash is useful at the end of the year, what services are going to get cut during the year because of that? If that's a fair characterization of, I'm channeling Don, so.
Yeah, yep, no, I remember that. And yeah, so I guess the genesis of my question was more around 0.3 and where our free cash was as a percentage of our operating budget. And that's the ultimate rainy day fund. So if that's in the place that it needs to be, then the annual allocation, think about it through like the P&L, doesn't really need to happen.
Yeah, I mean, the reason I put it in there and bring it to the committee as a talking point is that there is this ongoing non-compliance with the reserve fund policy. The practical solution seems to have been to keep it escalating from around 200,000 to around 2.25, and whether to simply recognize that, and then comparing it to expenditures, it has been adequate the last few years. Whether to recommend that, because it's practically the right number in light of the pressure that would put on the operating budget by parking that money in a lockbox account. Chris, your hand is up.
Yeah, I just want to follow up by saying that the reserve fund provides, as you said, two purposes. It's an emergency fund for those kinds of things that unplanned, unexpected, and we just don't have the cash for. And it also has the free cash. It's important that we have some money in conservative operating budgets because sometimes things move around there too, whether somebody retires or we have to hire some new employee or something else happens. You want to have that flexibility inside the budget too. So every dollar that the reserve fund goes up, it really means that kind of flexibility comes out of the budget. And considering that we're working on the margins tighter than as tightly as we should be appropriately, I'm concerned about taking away that internal budget flexibility. It's not a lot, right? It's not like we always know it's in one place or another. It's important to have that so that we can know that there's a little money here, a little money there for that study we didn't plan to do. And I'm not talking about small margin stuff, or someone retired and the person we're succeeding them with cost more than we thought because of the market. It's important to have that flexibility in the budget too. And again, that if we don't spend it, the goal is not to spend every dollar. Obviously, we want to be tight. That goes back to free cash too. Departmentally, though, it's very random. I mean, it could be public works one year and facilities one year, or it could be building department one year. It kind of depends. And I really do want to preserve. I think it's important for the town to preserve that level of flexibility for the schools too, though they have vastly more flexibility than town does anyway with their budgetary operations.
Mary?
Yeah, so just maybe trying to bring this conversation back to point 2. What you've added, Rob, is a little bit of each. I'm just curious where the majority opinion is about what tack to take.
I think that's the right question, and then we can conform the draft to that and move on. So I highlighted it because I didn't want to. Go ahead, Mary.
If I could just add one more thing, I think what would be important to include if we as an advisory committee thought it would be worthwhile for the select board to look at that percentage is to include just some of Chris's points and Don's points about what that allows room for in the budget. That might, in terms of, so the vote, if we voted to say, perhaps think about 0.65% or whatever it is because of XYZ, if we're just going to do that. I mean, even though it seems like we've never funded it at 1%. So that's might be moot. I don't know.
I mean, it does provide a ceiling, but we're in no danger of punching through that. Do you want to go with just kind of moving forward with this incrementally, since it really doesn't create an actual movement of dollars? I mean, the fund is going to, the reserve fund is going to be funded to what it gets funded to, and that's likely to be $270,000, give or take. What if we included language that says that, you know, there should by, you know, without deciding it in the budget message, that the, you know, reserve fund policy should be revisited. Chris, do you know, is this a town meeting issue or is this a policy that can be set by the select board?
This is a select board policy.
I thought so. So then why don't we,
With the advisor committees.
yeah, then why don't we, instead of trying to decide it now, maybe identify it as an issue that should be resolved in this fiscal year, one way or the other. And then put it on our agenda down the road to bring up with the select board and make some decision. It's a little bit of can kicking, but you know, I think everything is worth talking about more than once. And people raise good issues on both sides of keep it, leave it, change it. Yes, no, anybody?
There really isn't a lot of time between now and when the budget for fiscal 24 will get set. I mean, it's like 5 months, right? So,
Yeah, I mean, this is the budget that we're suggesting. What should they do in that budget? And in the past, the advisory committee has repeatedly said, fund this to 1%. And in the past, the budgets haven't gone much above 60%. So, I mean, we could, you know, the definition of insanity obviously is a problem. You know, I just thought maybe we change the conversation a little bit and talk about if no one's going to pay any attention to the policy, maybe the policy should be dealt with to conform to the reality. I just don't see a budget coming forward with $450,000 on that line and a budget being moved forward by the select board at that number, because they're going to be $210,000, $220,000 that is going to be way more attractively used elsewhere. Even though when it's used by free cash, it's you know, supporting the governance of the town, but that's after the fact.
and just so I understand, the clean memo dated today is literally last year's document with a new
Correct.
date put on it.
That is
Today's
correct.
date put on it. The second one with the gaps and the holes to fill and the all caps, that's a draft for this year.
That's my mess. Yeah.
Okay.
Just
No,
some
I just
talking points.
wanted to understand what it, wanted to make sure I understood, because when I read the first one and it was dated today, it was all about fiscal 23, which is, that ship is long since sailed.
Yeah, no, that's literally the text of last year's message. And
Okay.
the other one
Got
is
it.
some suggested updates. I mean, I assume, just to kind of breeze past it, I made some grammatical improvements to the first paragraph, which is just precatory, you know, let's do this. You know, and continue to be responsible. So really is just, how would the committee like to, I mean, do people tend to favor telling the select board that they should fund it all the way up again and then argue about it when the budget comes along? There are arguments against, or to note specifically that there's a tension, an ongoing tension between the policy and the practice that has little prospect of being resolved, and that the policy, you know, if you're not going to do it this year, we should change the policy, or some better idea. I just see it as a kind of a binary choice.
I mean, unless it can be written, you know, something to the effect of, you know, the goal of 1%, you know, taking into account the current needs of the budget, you know, the budgetary needs of the town or something, and just have the language be flexible rather than having to target a specific number.
I see that. That might play to kind of express both thoughts at the same time. Ellen, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I'm gonna retract my previous statement because I didn't really have the benefit of looking at the spreadsheet prior to formulating my comments. So I will reverse on that position I stated before.
I withheld evidence from the grand jury, for which I apologize. I was a little, so Ellen, what am I understanding you saying that like you're less concerned about hitting the 440 given the track record of actual expenditure?
Yeah, now that I had a chance to look at it, yes.
Okay.
Right.
Mary?
Well, the spreadsheet doesn't have the FY22 expenditures. Is that because there were none?
We didn't make any.
So there weren't any. So yeah, there's substantial give back. So even if we goal to 0.6 and we get 0.45, we're still going to give back. So
Yeah, well, I think if we said the goal is 0.6 and a budget came up that tried to cut back on that, I think that would be something about which the advisory committee should resist, because that would be, well, I'm trying to think of a word for it that I can say in a public meeting. Not good. It would not be good. It would not be best practices. I would be pretty irritated. And I don't think that our town administration, you know, the town hall would do that. I think they've settled on a number that works in the budget and reflects the risks that are managed by the reserve fund as a practical matter, and that's where we're at. Mary?
I would just like it to be a little clearer in point number 2, that, and perhaps include something like the advisory committee very much believes in adhering to the policies that have been set. And in this instance, perhaps the policy needs to be reviewed. And I don't see that as kicking the can. I mean, the select board is ultimately going to make this decision, but I think we need to say that that needs to be looked at.
I very much agree with that. Does anybody else have thoughts on that portion of it? Strongly positive, strongly negative.
I agree.
Yeah, so we'll if you know, we'll craft a response that says, you know, there's a target, there's a policy, we've historically not hit it. It's important that policies are respected, or if they're not functioning, they should be addressed, not ignored. Why don't we, since it's a budget message, we should probably take a position that we recommend, you know, not less than 200, whatever the projected number for next year is. I think it's 248, maybe, you know, I'll find it. Not less than, not a penny less than that for the reserve fund would be, you know, is an appropriate number. And that there should be, that, you know, this should be reviewed and dealt with in a way that reflects a policy that reflects what the actual funding is going to be. If everybody's okay with that, comments? All right, if everybody's good with that, Mary and I will make a paragraph that says something like that and send it forward. Mary, does that work for you?
Yep.
All right. Paragraph 3 carries forward a sentiment that's been in every budget message that I've seen going back to 2017 or so, that the free cash balance is important and it should be maintained. I think we all agree with that based on comments of a few moments ago. Does anybody have anything on that one? Okay. So 4 and 5, and Mike, I'd be interested in your take on these. The prior text reflected the advisory committee's concern, which was shared by capital budget and lately the select board, about capital needs and wants on the one hand and capital funding on the other. And you can see from the text that was there that, you know, the town has, the select board has put a committee in place to try to answer that question. So I kind of reduced the text to reflect that. Just my suggestion. So does anybody have comments, additions, subtractions, criticisms, high praise? Just thought I'd throw that in there just in case.
No, I personally, I like what's been edited because it was a bit of editorializing, and the long range planning committee addresses a lot of those concerns.
Agree.
Okay, and I used an extra vocab word there, saying that paramount consideration should be
Nice.
given to maintenance of town assets. I was very proud. Which is now redundant with number 6. Now that I look at it, so still, I don't think we can emphasize maintenance enough. I'll just make sure that it's all in one paragraph and makes sense.
Can I
The,
just ask Rob, sorry to interrupt, but just.
No,
you know,
please go ahead.
On the capital, is this the right place to address the ongoing question around a number, you know, the $2 million number for capital versus a percentage of the operating budget?
Yes,
That's-
yes. I forgot about that. I meant to add it. Thank you, Mike. What Mike's referring to, and he'll correct me if I'm wrong, is we have heard at various meetings, I think a persuasive point by the capital budget committee, that the capital budget line of the line of the budget for capital projects is stuck at a number, $1.9 million. And every year that goes by, the $1.9 million buys less and less capital. So the capital budget committee is pushing for that line to be increased. Just, you know, and Brian Host makes, you know, a good case with math as to, you know, what would $1.9 million in 2017 dollars be now, and it's a good deal more. And you know, he's not wrong. So we're starving capital in the budget by keeping that number static. Now, immediately that number begins to compete with the same things we talked about in connection with the reserve fund and free cash. I mean, you know, we live in a world of scarce resources, unfortunately, but I think there should, thank you, Mike. I had thought about this and I just failed to put it in the draft. What do you think we should, something along the lines of the advisory committee recognizes that the capital line's been static and that it should be addressed, because what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, something like that, because I mean, whether it's a private or a public entity, as your underlying asset base grows, the cost of maintaining that's going to go up, which is why a percentage tied to it that grows over time at some rate makes more sense than, right? The capital budget's been 1.9 for 10 years. And clearly our assets have grown and things like that. And so that's why, I mean, I don't want to, you know, speak for the capital committee, but in the discussions we've had, that's where assigning a percentage of the operating budget makes sense versus a static number, which, all things being equal, will not do the job year in and year out.
Okay. or we'll come up with absolute wording, but it will be close to what you just said. Patrick, if everybody agrees, of course. Patrick?
Yeah, I think the question is on the recommend, I think we'll get, I think we're probably pretty much in agreement that it should be increased. The question is for a cost of living adjustment, a COLA adjustment for this, you go back and look at 10 years of what, an average increase, 2.5%, 3% budget increase should have been over the years and try to do a makeup? Or do you just start it now and make it the policy to go forward on a going forward basis? My understanding, this is capital expenditures themselves. It's not some sort of reserve fund for maintenance or expenditures associated with past capital.
That's correct.
We turn a bunch of stuff away every year. This is not like the reserve fund discussion where we don't have items that are begging for this money. We have more items begging for this money that we've never funded properly.
You're right on both points. Going backwards from the second one, the capital budget committee every year starts its explanation of its decision-making process by how much it declined to fund because it had to. And then the second part of your comment was, are we talking about going back and bringing 1.9 up across 10 years, which would be a very, very big number. I don't even think that the capital budget committee is suggesting that. I think they just want to do a reset so that from year to year, the capital budget line doesn't fall farther behind. And I suppose in any given budget, you can have a discussion about whether that should be reset somewhat higher to deal with a backlog, but I'm not sure that given our budget and our revenue, that's practically possible. It'd be difficult enough to begin to inflate it against all kinds of other things, other expenses, healthcare, labor, etc. But I do think that we should include in our budget message that this is an issue that needs to be addressed. At least I think it very much does. I think Mike does too. Does anybody else have any comments? I'll take that as approval that we should craft something along the lines of what Mike just said. The other two bullet points that I had was some language about, encouraging continuing to pursue grants and available funds. That's not controversial. If there's money out there to be had, please go get it. And then something about, I think just without saying, that we have a new finance director, to just say something encouraging along the lines of, we look forward to continuing, excellent reporting and award-winning books and things like that, just to make it perfectly clear that we appreciate and and will continue to appreciate good work in the support of all these budget things. Is there anything that anyone would like to add, subtract? Okay, then I think in order to kind of get this to where it needs to be, a motion to authorize the chair and vice chair to compile a budget message based on these comments and transmit it to the select board.
So moved.
We got a motion. We got a second. Somebody?
I'll second.
Mary.
Thank you, Mary. I got a written question and it's from Mike Dick, so it's not, just kind of random. He was asking that we summarize what we concluded as to point 3. But he hasn't a document in front of him. So to the extent Mike's listening, my understanding on point 3 is that we continue to endorse the town pursuing the undesignated fund balance, the free cash balance in the range that it's been recommended for the last few years. That's what I'm reading, both in our document and the last 3 or 4 budget messages. Does that square with everybody's understanding? Good. I hope that's satisfactory to Mike. I don't think that's, I got thanks in all caps, Swedish shouting. Excellent. So we have a motion and a second. We'll vote by roll call. Mike Barclay,
Aye.
Patrick Kennedy,
Aye.
Mark Maggi,
Aye.
Ellen Mar,
Aye.
Mary McGoldrick,
Aye.
and Rob Hillman. I too am an aye. Mary, I'll circulate something and we'll get it over to the select board by the end of the week. So thank you. So returning to our agenda, I had liaison assignments. I know Mike has something to tell us, and I suspect that Mary and or Ellen has had some communications in their liaison assignments as well. So Mike, do you want to go first?
Sure. So on the 12th of September, the newly formed Capital Committee met again. And, I think the committee's trying to find its footing in a little bit in terms of what its exact mandate is, what we might want the conclusion to be. But I think the genesis of it all along was the recognition that we have a lot of capital projects across the town. And in many ways, before we even start talking about individual projects, we want to try to, as best as possible, estimate exactly what is the cost of all of these projects. And then on the other side of the ledger, begin to talk about how we can possibly fund that. And that's where the meeting began. And, again, when we're talking about funding, hopefully it's not only just issuing debt, but, it's public-private partnerships, finding grants, basically being as creative as we can on the funding side, because we know the costs are massive. And, in particular, the big item that came up, of course, is the schools, in part because that is the biggest project probably. And also given the way that, the MSBA works, is that, they have a process, and that process in some ways can dictate the timeline. If you get accepted into their program, can dictate the timeline. So as much as we want to try to aggregate all the needs of the town and put together a well thought out plan of how we can possibly spread the funding around to address as many as possible, I think there has to be a recognition that with the schools and dealing with the MSBA, that there may be some, we'll find out, I think no later than January, whether or not we're going to be accepted into that. And then that starts certain timelines running from there in terms of design and approval of that. So, I mean, in a nutshell, that's what we talked about is, trying to address how to, we got to begin to put all of the needs in one place with no preferential treatment to anyone, and then start to think about the funding and hopefully be able to square those, the needs, the sources and uses of cash as best as we can. I don't know, Rob, is that a fair?
That is a fair and accurate
Yeah, I mean,
description of.
We try to not go down any specific project rabbit holes. Water also actually weighed in that they could have something significant. Sewer believes that they can be self-funded in terms of whatever needs may come up. And so anyway, so Mary, I see you have a question or your hand.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, at the outset, you mentioned the capital committee. Were you talking about the long range planning committee or the?
Yes, long range planning committee. Yeah, apologize for not.
And is there, I mean, in these meetings, one of my questions is there I'm sure there's an awareness, but I guess how much attention is given to projects that are very nearly shovel ready at this juncture, and projects like the schools that even if we have a positive response from the MSBA are 3-4 years out at best, I would think. I mean, that whole process takes a while.
Yeah.
So,
I'm sorry. Go ahead, Mary.
No, that was basically it. Just what is already received a lot of committee time, work, due diligence, plans to projects that need to be addressed, like the schools, like water and so forth, but that are newer in terms of their, how much has been done, which doesn't mean that they're less important in any regard.
Yeah, I think, well, to start with, I think we're trying to be relative, I mean, recognizing the realities of what you said around timing and things like that. We, obviously have to be cognizant of that. I think initially, though, we're trying to be somewhat agnostic in that we want to try to figure out as best as we can over, a 10 or 20-year period or whatever that timeline is, what the needs are and what the total cost is. And then we can start to look at, like the debt capacity of the town. That's one of the things that we're waiting for the new finance director to come on so we could sit with her, look at where the debt is now, what the scheduling is, how it rolls off over time, so that we can begin to kind of craft, okay, if we need to issue debt, when's going to be a good time to do it, not taking into account, rates or anything like that. And so we're trying to be bigger picture, but also start to, bring the funnel down and set timelines. But we didn't get that far in the meeting on the 12th.
I think I was at the meeting also. I think it's fair to say that there's a conscious effort to push back from aggregating or prioritizing any sort of specific projects at this point. It's still much more of a, how do you create a framework? Yeah. How do you create a framework for evaluating these things? And there's, some discussion about how, projects get momentum and, best practices for evaluating the long-term financial aspects of them. But there's a lot still to do. And there's a recognition that, particularly, when there was discussion of the schools project, that it's in Cohate, very early stage and of a completely undefined scope at this point. But it could, as Mike points out, as we learned from our meeting with the school facilities committee, is that, if MSBA does certain things, it can move very, very quickly. So we're going to need both of these committees. So we need to be prepared to move with it, if in fact there isn't it. So, so that's kind of where that committee's at. Hopefully its brief aligns with the goals that we're endorsing. So anything else, Mike?
I was just going to say, my understanding is the MSBA is touring the school on the 28th of September.
That's
So,
correct.
I think that's really important because that's going to be when we maybe get their first impression of where they may be leaning. And, again, it could have changed, but I know when we did the East School, all of a sudden the timeline, we had to work with the timeline so that we could make sure that votes were at town meeting and stuff like that. But it is, you've got to play ball with what the MSBA, what their schedule is and how their funding is too, because they've got funding needs too.
And whether and to what extent they're willing to fund
Right.
at all. So,
Yeah.
the ask is very, very broad and in the statement of interest. And one day we're going to get an answer from MSBA. We're going to have quite a lot to talk about, I suspect. But
Correct. Yeah. But it's good. But I think it was a productive meeting. And again, like Rob said, to try to create a framework to have a more systematic approach to this. And also ultimately, having some interaction with the rating agencies as well, because I think, I don't think, but I know that, we're a AAA rated town and rating agencies do expect AAA rated towns to invest for the future. And more than that, they also want to see a well thought out plan. And that would be, to me, one of the goals of this committee was to be able to go to the rating agencies and to potential investors in our debt and demonstrate that we have a well thought out plan to address the long-term needs of Cohasset.
Thank you for doing all that, Mike. It's great.
Good, okay, Mary, you had,
Yes, so we were able to connect with the new chair of the school committee, who's Lance Dial. And just wanted to touch base with them, introduce the essentially the school committee subcommittee, and let them know that we were just looking to be helpful. So we were able to connect, and then we had a great phone conversation yesterday. So I think we are all on the same page, which is great. I reached out to Susan Owen just to get the end of the year budget numbers, which she's presenting tonight. I don't know if I'll have a chance to see that later, Ellen, if we could put our slippers on and watch the school committee meeting later. But in any event, just to start the communication now, because especially they have, if you read the statement of interest, there are some very significant issues with the physical building at the middle high school. And when we were talking earlier about the reserve fund and things that might go as over tea kettle, there's more than a couple up there. So it will just be interesting. But if we can keep the lines of communication open along the way, that will all be good.
so, and also you've been in contact with did I hear it say, or perhaps that an attempt to connect with our subcommittee and the school committee's subcommittee to have a joint meeting at some point?
Yes, so they have, their finance committee is now called their budget and resources committee. So they have renamed themselves. And I just did ask for a list of when their postings were going to come up so that we could then post. So if there's at least 2 of us there, we can attend those meetings, listen in and have some conversations around that.
Right. Okay, I don't know whether there are any other liaison things that have come up. I don't know of any. So then moving on, I always kind of a standing entry here, Chris, what are we looking at, for projecting for STM, and what should we, be concerned about making sure that we're prepared? And also, if you happen to know, what's the date range at which that warrant has to go to the printer? My recollection is usually the first week in November.
So the select board delayed the opening for citizen petitions a week, so they just did that last night. So the citizen petition deadline expires next Tuesday night now. And in terms of, so I don't know what'll come in from that. I know that I've heard that there may be a couple percolating out there, but until they're actually in hand, I don't want to speculate. In terms of others, the water department has 4. So we've actually already grinding. Some are capital related. They're going to go to capital. There are we have a tentative agreement with the police union to support getting out of civil service for the police, and that would have to go through town meeting and then get a home rule petition from the legislature, because that's how town got into civil service in the first place, was through town meeting.
There is a bylaw that requires any contract that's going to town meeting floor to be reviewed by the advisory committee. I think it's 30 days ahead of time. So
We don't have that. It's not done yet, but once it will, so October should be fairly busy. I think you should kind of plan to sketch out at least 2 or 3 meetings. One of them may be for contracts, and the contracts don't go to ratification per se. We really have the money already funded. That said, we should present them anyway. And obviously, the getting out of civil service is kind of it's a big win. It's also a big deal. There's some unpaid bills. I'm afraid that it looks like that, our transitioning period there got a little more frayed than I hoped. I don't know what the final numbers are, but they're not really awesome. So that said, their bills have to get paid. They got to get paid. And just there'll be some small budget transfers in there. Conservation has potentially cleaned up some language in the stormwater bylaw. I don't think it's a big deal. There's nothing zoning. There's the zoning bylaw committee requested a placeholder, but I don't think there's anything that's going to be ready really, because we really have to be ready now, and it's not. So I hope to have a formalized draft warrant done next week to get to everybody, so you can start looking at it and scheduling reviews. I do want to, I got to put a bow on some of these potential budget adjustments and the allocation for cash. Now, we also have the books are not closed. Well, normally this would have happened already. And that we still have one, Don is still working for us on a contract basis through his firm. And we're not done. So Jennifer Mullen, our new finance director accountant, has been in regular contact with staff. So she's ready to jump in to move things as quickly as possible so that we have hopefully everything certified for December. Again, I should have something for you at the very beginning next week, but that's kind of the, it's longer than it could be as long as 15 articles. Though it doesn't, it's not as bad as that sounds. A lot of them are, at the water department had 4. And sorry, there's a couple of others that are a little unusual. One is a renewal of the lease for the water department for the cell towers, which is not a big deal, but it's up. The other is to get a home rule petition to allow a small piece of Wheelwright Park in the general vicinity of that existing old radar tower tester to be used for a cell tower. That would light up the entire that northeast corner of town, which is a horrible area for cell coverage. So that's been explored for many months, and this seems to be the area that works. So that's likely to come to town meeting as well for authorization to get the legislature. So it's kind of a mixed bag of things. I mean, all are important, and they're all timely. So
I just want to make sure that, we're, able to schedule, appropriate diligence for all these things, and we're not just rushing, as the type is being set to go to the printer to try and come up with these sorts of things. So we can get a draft sooner, well, when you're ready, but it sounds like sometime next week, that'll get us off to a good start. I see Mike's hand.
Yeah, Chris, just, I don't know if this will come up, but I was just curious if there was any update on the elevator work at town hall rather, because we allocated money there at the last meeting.
Yes, so I got a very quick, I just came back this morning, very early this morning from the first conference in 3 years. So so Michelle and I passed very quickly. I mean, I ended up just jumping right into meetings all the entire time I was in the building. So the answer is yes, they were able to come on site, and the preliminary indication is that they may not have to use the scaffolding they were initially talking about, so maybe less impactful. And again, the company seems optimistic that there won't be any real problem down below. That said, we'll see, right? So that said, they're coming, I think next week to do that kind of initial on-site look again to finalize what the work plan will be, but they've actually started, and again, very preliminary, but the initial look is a little more positive than we thought it might be.
Thanks.
Anything else?
So I would just
Yeah.
recommend that you set up some dates in October. I think this has to be done. The select board's last day is November 1st to button up the warrant. Now, again, if things miss for whatever reason and you can't get recommended, we can sneak a recommendation in. Maybe that said, it has to be in everyone's hands the Monday after Thanksgiving. And so it means we have to get it to the printer clearly well before Thanksgiving because of everything, and it has to get printed. And I don't want to find out we have a supply chain problem with paper. I think that's all okay right now, but we have to be cognizant. So we really want to get this to the printer in early November just to be really safe, because we don't want to be running these on a photocopy machine and running them to the post office.
No, I couldn't agree more. That's why I ask, is that I want it to be orderly, and but I want us to be able to do our job. So it looks like we've got some Wednesdays in October. So is there anything further for Chris on this, or we can sort of move to scheduling? And I don't think we have any minutes. So, all right. So why don't we talk about scheduling, which is associated with adjournment on my not very well written agenda. Looking at calendars, today's the 21st. I'm not sure that we're going to have anything material to address a week from today, the 28th. But we should probably put down a meeting for the 5th. Does anybody think? I just don't see that we're going to have, unless Chris disagrees, I think we can distribute material. Liaisons whose committees are affected can get with them, and we'll schedule a meeting for the 5th. And then there are 3 more Wednesdays in October, the 12th, 19th, and 26th. I mean, we could put a placeholder in each one of them. I will not be here on the 12th. Actually, I might be here on the 12th. Terribly jet lagged to be on the 12th. So I don't have a strong opinion either way. Mike?
Yeah, I'll be on a plane on the 5th. So that's the only, I'm the 12th, 19th, and 26th, they're fine by me, but the 5th isn't, I won't be able to attend.
All right. I mean, regret, we'll
Yeah.
just have to manage, unless there's a real quorum crushing issue. Ellen, I see your hands up.
I'm not available on the 12th.
Yeah, the 12th is, I mean, it's in a, Mary?
Just to note that the 5th is Yom Kippur, and I don't know if, just so we can be sensitive to that.
I mean, yes, you're right. I mean, do you think we should just not meet that night or?
I don't have,
I'll-
What,
Yom-
yes?
I'm told that Yom Kippur starts the night before and ends at sundown, so it's not an issue.
We meet
for
at 7.
the night of the 5th.
Yeah,
I
and
just wanted to
That's
bring,
what
let me put it, if anyone has strong feelings about it and would like to contact me separately, please do. I'm not sure whether anyone's affected by it. I am not. But if people are, if needs be, we'll move it. Patrick's theological insights are greater than mine, so we've expressed, we'll appoint him advisory committee theologian for all future purposes. And but you're right, as far as I understand it. So we'll see if there's if that creates a problem. If it does, we'll accommodate. I'm going to accommodate. I think I'm sure that's the big, the most highest of the high holidays. So we'll avoid it if that's what we should do. Why don't we tentatively say the 5th, and we'll see how it goes. What do you think about the 12th? Tentatively yes, tentatively no. It's kind of a holiday week, kind of, sort of.
yeah, I'll be away.
That's 3 or 4 of us who won't be here on the 12th.
Yeah.
So I think we scratch the 12th, pencil in the 19th and 26th, and we'll see where that gets us.
Sounds good.
I'll
All
do
right.
my best for the October meetings. Depends on what happens to the federal budget and whether or not we're in a continuing resolution or a government shutdown or whether we have a budget and I'm traveling. But I won't know that until October 1. So I've got some work travel planned in October if there's a federal budget, but if there's not, I'll be sitting at home waiting for these meetings.
Now I'm conflicted. I'd like to have you at our committee meetings, but I'd rather not the federal government cease to function. So
If there's a government shutdown, I'll have nothing but time for this committee. So
outstanding.
Minutes, you'll take over minutes.
Okay, I think we have a plan. We'll mark those up and we'll circulate agendas, etc. So that takes us to the end of our business. Unless anybody has any further comments, we can entertain everybody's favorite motion.
motion to adjourn.
Second,
Moved and seconded. Mike Barclay,
Aye.
Patrick Kennedy,
Aye.
Mark Maggi,
Aye.
Ellen Mar,
Aye.
Mary McGoldrick,
aye.
Rob Hillman, I too am an I. So thanks very much.